For this episode, pegged to the International Day in support of the victims of torture, I wanted to find a couple of experts who could answer for me whether it's ever a good idea to engage in torture or to look past where torture is happening. And I found a couple of great ones right here at the Institute. Ambassador Clint Williamson, who heads up our international rule of law and security programs and used to be the first ambassador at large for war crimes for the United States, and Lieutenant General Ben Freakley, who has a huge role in our leadership programs, used to be a commanding general in places like Afghanistan and dealt with this firsthand. Please give it a listen.
This is Luke Knittig, and you're in the arena with leaders and citizens who take character-based action. In the Arena is a proud member of the Democracy Group podcast network. For more information, visit democracygroup.org.
It's an honor to welcome Lieutenant General Ben Freakley and Ambassador Clint Williamson in the arena. I believe it's welcome back to Ben. And, you know, we have a tough subject today. Of course, difficult conversations are not something that the McCain Institute shies away from. We're here to talk about torture, in part because the International Day in support of the victims of torture is June 26th each year and has been since 97. We'll talk a little bit more about that. And because John McCain, our namesake and inspiration for the institution, suffered torture during the Vietnam War for more than half a decade. In fact, before I turn it over to each of you for kind of opening thoughts and to get the conversation going, I thought if you'll indulge me, I'd read a quote from his floor speech in 2014 about torture. Most of all, I know the use of torture compromises that which most distinguishes us from our enemies, our belief that all people, even captured enemies, possess basic human rights, which are protected by international conventions the U.S. not only joined, but for the most part, authored. Both of you have extensive operational experience and have studied this and are still involved with it. Who wants to kind of lead off on how any of that strikes you and what we should talk about? Ben, you got your hand in there first. You probably want to come off mute, and then away you go.
I was actually deferring to Ambassador Williamson, but I'll make a few comments, sure. So, you know, I served in the military for almost 37 years, and in that time period, I was the commanding general of a joint task force in Afghanistan, conducting all combat operations for the United States and, for that matter, NATO on the eastern half of Afghanistan, east of the Hindu Kush up against Pakistan. And during that period of time, we ran about 630 to 650 detainees, which I visited every 2 weeks. And when I reflect on this and reflected on it as early as early combat operations in 1990 in Desert Shield, Desert Storm, when I was a brigade operations officer, and we took prisoners, I first think about it, how torture is morally and ethically wrong. In my training and my assessment and my personal view, there is no justification ever for torture, for the mistreatment of a fellow human being. It is, in fact, completely inconsistent with our national values. We're the country that believes in rule of law. We're the country that stands on our founding documents, the Declaration of Independence that calls for all men being created equal and their God-given right to pursue happiness and life and liberty. Our Constitution has multiple clauses that one can draw, and the court, and Ambassador Williams is far more able to talk about this, but the court, our highest court, has talked about the Constitution and where it stands with the treatment of people. You know, if you get into experienced interrogators and military intelligence analysts, they'll tell you that torture and abuse is not effective whatsoever. I've talked to them about it because the purpose of talking to someone is to gain reliable, truthful, and accurate information. And you do not get that when you torture someone, because they'll do anything to get out of the pain. They'll lie, they'll misinform you, they'll agree with you, whatever you're trying to lead them to. Neurological scientist who the Army has used to talk says that abuse compromises memory, mood, and cognitive function. And we know from studies, I was a commanding officer at the National Training Center, and there's study after study over decades of the National Training Center that when someone's deprived sleep, the first thing that goes is critical reasoning and functioning. So we've seen that even in people who aren't abused but just suffer sleep deprivation from operational considerations. It's also completely in our, for our nation, it completely shifts the support to the military away from the military, which is something that needs to really be nurtured, because we saw in the Vietnam War where the population didn't support the military. And also for our enemies, abuse and torture is a rallying cry. It helps them. It helps them recruit, helps them get funding, helps them have a function and a passion and a motivation to fight us. So it just does not work whatsoever. And in base principle, it is illegal. And in the United States, we are strongest as a nation when we live and demonstrate our core values. And when we lower our values to that of our enemy, we look like our enemy. We don't look like America anymore. And there's no moral justification for who we are. I'll also say that, we're signatories to the Geneva Convention. And after the Second World War, the convention was very clear about its rights for wartime prisoners, wounded, sick, and non-combatants. And in fact, we are obliged and have the moral responsibility to protect those who we have in our custody. And that's the way I saw it in Afghanistan. And they are guaranteed humane treatment. They are guaranteed no abuse or discrimination. They're guaranteed that we'll meet their medical needs. And in Afghanistan, we provided first-class medical care, dental care, even optometry to our detainees. So, there's just no grounds for torture. I would also say that the soldier creed, which every soldier says that they will live the Army values. And from our youngest soldier to our most senior general officer, we expect people to live the values of duty to fulfill their moral obligation. And that moral obligation is live up to the UN statement, Convention Against Torture, the Geneva Convention, and American rule of law. We also say that we will respect others, and we can respect our opponent, our enemy. We also enforce on our soldiers the sense of integrity to do what is right. And torturing fellow man is not right. It just doesn't, it's not inconsistent with our Army values, let alone our national values. And lastly, to demonstrate personal courage and moral courage in particular. And even while I'm embarrassed as a soldier, and it's something that I will carry with me my whole career, that while I was a general officer, Abu Ghraib happened in Iraq. I was not there. I was in the United States, but I was still a general officer. I'm still responsible for the institution of the Army. But I'm very proud of the fact that a young soldier living the Army values of moral courage stood up when he told his chain of command that the abuse of our fellow man in Abu Ghraib prison was wrong, and they didn't listen to him or change their behavior. He stood up against it and went to the media, and the media brought it out, and then we started to correct that injustice. And I'm disappointed that we had that happen while I was a general officer and a leader in our Army, but I'm very proud of the young man who demonstrated moral courage and stood up for what is right. So that's where I stand today, and I firmly believe then and believe now as a member of the McCain Institute that there's no justification for torture whatsoever.
Thanks, Ben. You didn't mention any words and really talk about the U.S. Perspective and a military perspective. Clint, you can talk about this around the whole world, and the reality is torture does happen, and it is happening. So talk about that.
Right. I just wanted to pull together the thrust of what both of you have said with a couple of points. I mean, first of all, as you said, Luke, this institute bears the name of John McCain, who throughout his career in public life was an outspoken critic of the use of torture by any country, but particularly our own. And obviously, he came at this issue from his own personal experience as a prisoner of war in Vietnam, where he was subjected to horrendous torture, something for which he bore the physical effects until the day he died. But no other person has risen so far in public life as did John McCain, who was actually a victim of torture. So he spoke with great authority on this issue. And I think in honoring his legacy, we should just be able to agree at the outset of any conversation on the use of torture that it runs counter to U.S. interests. First and foremost, it's inconsistent with American values. Secondly, it contravenes our adherence to domestic and international law. And thirdly, it's ineffective in producing reliable and/or actionable information for intelligence or law enforcement purposes. So primarily, it's a moral issue, but it's also a practical concern. And so I look forward to discussing this with Ben and with you in the next few minutes.
Well, and I, I kind of want to get y'all cross-talking. I think it's going to be the most effective way. But, y'all know a lot more about this than I do. But the Convention Against Torture that the UN adopted only happened in '87. This day in support of victims of torture only happened in '97. That kind of strikes me as interesting. I know you have laws of warfare and Geneva Convention and other things that are at play there. And then there are countries, regimes, however you want to look at it, that use torture as a policy, as a strategy, arguably to some effect. How do you take that on? I mean, you can't deny that happens, and what do we, how we wrestle with that?
Well, I think this is just, if I can start, this is one of the arguments that's put out there often, and particularly when you're dealing with people, for example, who are fighting with Al-Qaeda or ISIS, that these people have absolutely no regard for human life and do not adhere to any sorts of rules. And therefore, why should we in fighting them? But I think, as John McCain said from the floor of the Senate, this is not about them. This is about us. I mean, what are our values? What do we stand for? I mean, we have fought some despicable enemies in the course of our history, and probably no one more so than Nazi Germany. But in fighting the Nazis, we did not become Nazis ourselves. We did not employ the same methods that they used. And so we came out of that conflict with a degree of moral authority and credibility and respect around the world that we never would have achieved had we engaged in that sort of activity. So it goes back to what Senator McCain said. This is about us and who we want to be and what we represent in the world.
Well, Clint, I think you're so right. And again, Senator McCain's credibility in this is it can't be matched. And he was a strident opponent throughout the whole period of the 9/11 era of torture and even before. But Luke, to your question, which I agree with Clint on, is that how do we deal with it is we have to be consistent and demonstrate to the world that we live our values. And when we're inconsistent, we lose the moral credibility that Clint was just talking about, that we came out of the Second World War. If you can argue that, the Japanese and the Germans were both despicable. But if you look at our treatment of both Japanese and Germans, it's a good news story. Now, not the internment of Japanese Americans. That's a whole different issue of abuse, but very real. But I think you have to be consistently in alignment with your values that Senator McCain talked about and demonstrate those to the world over time to hold that moral high ground. And Clint, you must have seen in the Balkans examples of people that were furious about Serb activity and other activity from other segments who wanted to take action. But it seems to me in your time and the time that I observed the U.S. Intervention in the Balkans, we held a pretty high ground on behavior and what we expected.
Absolutely. And this is one of the arguments that I encountered often as a war crimes prosecutor, is particularly from the Croats, from the Bosnians, who I think rightfully saw themselves primarily as victims at the outset of the war. And this attitude is, well, because we're victims, if we broke the laws of war, that's not a war crime because we were just defending ourselves. But even if you're defending yourself, even if you have the moral high ground going into a conflict, you still are obligated to follow these rules. And Luke, you brought up this issue of the Convention of Torture being a relatively recent development, dating back to 1987. The United States signed it in 1988 and ratified it in 1994. But this concept goes back much further in the United States and globally, as you said, with the Geneva and Hague Conventions, but even going back to the Civil War, which was the first time that any country had ever created rules for the conduct of armies in a conflict, in the Lieber Code, which was done at the request of President Lincoln, and it forbid torture, going back to the 1860s. So this is something that has been a constant in American policy over all these years. In my time as ambassador for war crimes issues, I sort of had a dual-headed role. I mean, one of these roles was to promote the concept of accountability around the world and to deal with issues like torture and genocide, how to prevent this and how to react to it. Secondly, I was responsible for negotiating transfers of detainees from Guantanamo back to their home countries or to third countries. And oftentimes I would speak around the world at universities, in other public settings. And the first questions that were always addressed to me were questions about U.S. hypocrisy. You know, how can you come and preach to us on these issues when you have Abu Ghraib, when you're operating Guantanamo? And the things that I would say is I would always acknowledge, yes, we are not a perfect country, but we have tried to adhere to these standards. We have supported this all the way through. And we have a robust military and civilian justice system. We have a media that investigates issues and bring them to the fore. We have a Congress that investigates things. So sometimes it doesn't happen as quickly as we like, but our system tries to address these issues. And it goes back to this fundamental belief that this is something that just runs counter to our values and what we should stand for as a country.
And maybe this is a little, out there. Torture is not the same as a nuclear weapon, but it seems like it can kind of be used as a weapon. You can have adversaries, bad guys, choose what you want to call them, that almost use it for the psychological effect, right? I mean, it's almost like terrorism in some ways, right? If you read an account of a fine American or someone that's, overdoing good with Doctors Without Borders or whatever, and you read that they're being tortured, it has an effect. Can you speak to that? How do you take that on? I mean, it's pretty diabolical, but it's out there.
Well, I mean, from my perspective, especially my time in Afghanistan, in the tribal areas and in much of Afghanistan, the literacy rate is 22%. So the recruitment age of young men, they don't have a lot of basis of knowledge to compare things to. So when you are told that your adversary, this being the West or the United States, doesn't like you, hates you, will persecute you, will not allow you to practice your religion, will torture you, and then all of a sudden something comes up where we have tortured or we exploit Guantanamo Bay, as Clint was speaking to, or we mistreat prisoners as we did in Abu Ghraib. These images reinforce this message of how terrible the enemy is and why it's so important to fight them. And so it's easy for recruiting because, again, there's no comparison. In fact, they don't know our history. They don't know the checks and balances that Clint was mentioning, our media doing great work in investigating issues, our Congress doing their oversight mission, the legal system inside the military, both with the inspector generals and our attorneys who make sure that we adhere to rule of law, our training. They don't know about any of those things. So what they know is what they've been fed in a madrasa or in a tribal area or wherever. And then they see these images that reinforce what they've been fed. And then recruitment goes up, motivation to fight goes up, people contribute to the cause. And again, you only fight it by ethical behavior, by demonstrating that you are who America says or wants to try to be. And Clint's so right. We're not a perfect nation, but I do think that when we make mistakes, we try to recognize those, admit those mistakes, and correct them and move forward. I mean, people were held accountable for Abu Ghraib. People were held accountable for actions. And, the other thing is, I think as a military leader is our young soldiers, thankfully, are disciplined and do what we ask them to do. But when a more senior leader asks them to mistreat a fellow human being, they live with that the rest of their life. That's a moral injury that they carry. And just as we have an obligation to protect our soldiers from kinetic effects and protect them as best we can with all our methodologies, we also have a requirement, a duty to protect them so they go home whole and they feel positive about their service and their duty to nation, and they're not damaged psychologically because we ask them to do something totally inconsistent with our values.
And I think this is an important point that you bring up, Ben, and it's the driving force behind our adoption and promotion of rules of war, the laws of war, has largely been driven from the military. I think sometimes there's this perception out there that this is some sort of left-wing human rightsy kind of thing to embrace this idea of sticking to the laws of war and defending human rights. But the military have been the strongest proponents of this all the way through. If we start allowing that sort of conduct in our own military, it is going to cause a breakdown in discipline, in morale. It is going to make us a less effective fighting force. A disciplined fighting force that follows the rules of war, that has pride in what they're doing, is going to be much more effective. And secondly, it is an issue of wanting to make sure that we are following the rules in the way that we would want our adversaries to do. It's very hard for us to call out an opposing force who is torturing or using, war crimes in their commission of combat if we're not willing to do the same thing. So we have to stick to those rules. And this is very much about protecting our own troops in making sure that we're not giving a green light to other countries to do the things to our troops that we would never want to see done.
So maybe a final question here. You can take it any way that you like. What do our senior leaders, and not military here? I think I'm focused on elected officials. I famously remember hearing how John McCain, when he traveled, would make a point in his media engagements or meetings to mention the names of people who were jailed. Not all of whom were being tortured, but I think a good many were, with the idea that it would get to them and give them some hope and some positive action. I guess leaders can do that, but what are other actions that leaders can take, and what do you keep an eye on kind of internationally for this issue?
I would say, first of all, and going back again to John McCain, as we said at the outset, he spoke with such moral authority on this issue because he himself was a victim of torture. And so most people don't come at the issue with that sort of experience and with the effects that, as I said, he bore until the day he died, where he couldn't raise his arm up to even comb his hair because of the torture that he was subjected to as a prisoner of war. But nevertheless, it's very, very important for our leaders to talk about this in the clearest terms possible. Anytime you start trying to be vague about this or play semantic word games and in any way try to excuse this behavior, as I said, you're opening the door. You're giving a green light to others to do the things that we would never want to see done to our own troops. So it is important for them to be unequivocal in their condemnation of torture, first of all. And then secondly, to the point that you raised, Luke, I think, as Senator McCain often did, going around the world, talking about those people that are being held as political prisoners, making sure that people in the public, in the media are aware of what's happening to them, but more importantly, making their own governments that we're aware of what's being done to them. This does create a degree of protection for them. It's not always effective. It's not always fail-safe, but it is something that we have to do. And this does need to come from our political leaders.
My take is, every couple of weeks, as I mentioned in my opening statement, I go over our detention facility in Afghanistan and walk through it, and I would talk to the detainees. And short of taking a human life, taking freedom away from someone is a very large burden. Our soldiers bore that burden, that made sure there was a safe detention facility. Our docs that worked in there, our interrogators that worked in there, all understood the responsibility, the obligation, but the burden of denying someone their freedom. And but we did it in such a way that we released every month probably 30% of those we held, and we had less than a 2% recidivism rate. So it just showed you that by treating people respectfully was important. So when I think about what senior leaders should do, I'm completely in agreement with Ambassador Williamson. Number one, we need to talk about it openly, unequivocally, no quibbling. There can be no rationalization about, there's always this discussion of the ticking time bomb scenario that, you've captured someone and they're making a bomb and that bomb's going to go off in a minute. You've got to get information right now. Totally false narrative. And it's, to me, it's a bit of a quibble. Well, and justification. There is no justification, as Senator McCain pointed out. There's no justification. So our senior leaders need to talk about it. They need to bring it up. In the military, senior leaders need to make sure that we have training at every level. For the entry-level soldier, they're trained. For the sergeants, they're trained. For the young officers, they're trained. War college students are trained. General officers are reminded of it. And thankfully, our legal judge advocates, they do that. They make sure you are trained. But also think at home, we need to look inward and ask about our prison systems. And are we just and equitable and demonstrate to the world that we're fair in denying freedom to our own citizens? And what do we think about that? And how do we deal with that? Because again, I truly do believe our country is a bright, shining city on a hill. And I think we can be an example to other countries. But if we don't talk about it, if we bury it, if we quibble and try to justify it, and we don't demonstrate it at home and abroad, we'll lose the moral authority that Clint talks about, which is so precious and has to be maintained. And we need to restore it even right now. We need to work on restoring it today, because when our diplomats go abroad, when leaders like Clint go abroad, as he pointed out, they'll be immediately questioned about, well, tell me what's going on here. Tell me what's going on there. So by example, by demonstrating our values, by talking about it, as Senator McCain did, I think that's how we reinforce that we don't stand for torture, we don't condone torture, and other countries that practice it, we can't be partners with if this is the way they're going to conduct themselves in a global society.
Well, gentlemen, we're going to end this conversation here, but we're certainly not going to leave this issue. And I deeply appreciate you coming into the arena with this frank and open conversation.
You're welcome.
Thank you.
This podcast is produced by Patrick McCann and Justin Kessler. If you like what you hear, please subscribe, tell your friends, or leave a review.